Hey everybody, welcome back to the Literary Gladiators. My name is Maya. I'm a guest today. Thanks for having me. Today we're talking about books, film, and music. Specifically the music part. Music has always been a really important part of my life, and I think that it is very applicable to talk about here because it ties in so heavily with literature, at least in my opinion. A lot of lyrics in themselves are effectively poetry. I think a lot about Rush. I grew up listening to Rush, the Canadian rock band, because my dad loves them, and I remember him telling me over and over that Neil, who was the drummer before he passed away, Neil Peart, was one of his favorite writers of all time, and just a meticulous, incredibly talented, extravagantly concise poet.
You know, and I see it so much in interpretations of lyrics because I try to make them a little bit vague, and I think of them just in a purely euphonious way. It just has to be a nice sounding series of syllables. And then if I can get an interrelation of rhythm in there that satisfies me as a craftsman, and if I can get some other symbolism in there that might be even just personal, that will just make me happier with it.
He'd play me songs like The Trees, Closer to the Heart, even Subdivisions, which is just about kind of a suburban angst and teenage pains and high school misery, and just be in awe of the lyrics. And he told me that when he was growing up, something he would do is when he'd get a new CD or a new cassette. I don't really know how that worked. Whatever he would buy that came with like a pamphlet of all of the lyrics, he would just sit there and pore over them and read them forever. So in that way, I think that lyrics are a form of literature, and music itself, like the notes, the melodies, the harmonies, all of that is its own form of literature. It's another way of telling a story, and at the end of the day, that's what books are meant to do. That's what we do here. I think there's been a bit of a resurgence in terms of that idea of lyricism being potentially more important than raw vocal talent and prowess. And in particular, I think about Taylor Swift. Taylor Swift is a very competent singer. I think that she puts a lot of emotion into her voice. She has quite a profound range. She's a pop star. However, I think the place that Taylor Swift shines most, and the place where she herself has said she feels she shines most, is in her lyricism, in her songwriting. She has an incredible knack for making songs that are deeply, deeply personal seem universal. She knows how to use specificity to her advantage, both to maintain privacy, to give her audience just enough of her to stay hooked, and to make them feel connected to the songs. Taylor Swift is actually a really good segue for us, because another thing that she is quite known for doing is inserting literary references into her songs. This is not unique to her at all, but it's Taylor Swift, and I will talk about Taylor Swift any chance I can. Also, season 3 of Dickinson, the show following Emily Dickinson, but with like a modern twist and spin. I've seen the first episode. I really want to watch more. Just haven't had time. College applications are killing me. Anyway, Dickinson is about Emily Dickinson, our beloved poet. And to my knowledge, they were able to acquire the rights to use the song Ivy by Taylor Swift in season 3 of Dickinson. This was really exciting for me to hear, even though I haven't had the chance to dive into the show yet, because I associated that song with Emily Dickinson, because it has a lot of references to her writing, the nature imagery, the sense of the inevitability of love and death and people getting in the way and things getting in the way of what you want and who you want to be, the idea of becoming, and also isolation. Taylor Swift also incorporates a lot of Great Gatsby references into her songs. You've got Roaring Twenties, Tossing Pennies, In the Pool, just a lot of hard-hitting visual imagery that ties into the glamour and glitz of that time, which of course we know was marred by things like intense racism, violence, and homophobia. I recently read a book called Last Night at the Telegraph Club by Malinda Lo, and it follows our main character, whose name is Lily, as she discovers things about herself, whether that has to do with her Chinese identity, her identity as an immigrant living in the United States, deportation, communism, and her sexuality. It was a really, really amazing look at intersectionality within a character in a time period that I'm fascinated by, the 1950s, and it was very much so influenced by the culture culture of queer bars and male impersonators and performance and things like that, which is really neat for me. Another video I'd like to make sometime is one, this is totally off topic, is one analyzing the relationship in literature and in life between the queer community and alcohol. I think it's a really interesting relationship because often clubs and bars were the only places that were safe for the queer community to express themselves, to meet people in public. And I think that that is, one, very interesting. It kind of persists today, and two, slightly damaging to have alcohol and party culture so heavily tied into a community that incorporates people of all ages, backgrounds, and ability. Just a side note. Anyway, the reason I bring up Last Night at the Telegraph Club is because it made me think a bit about The Joy Luck Club by Amy Tan, and then it also explores generational relationships between like mothers and daughters in Chinese culture. And Amy Tan then led me to Stephen King because they were in a band together, and this is where our video gets back on track. So yes, Amy Tan and Stephen King were in a band together, which I knew because my dad told me, but also because I'm pretty sure it's mentioned at least a little bit in On Writing. But I was trying to think of books that are influenced by music, because we've talked about how music is influenced by books and by literature and how it is literature in its own right. But I was trying to think about music as it pertained to books, and what I came up with was Stephen King, who is, of course, a musician, but also who uses song lyrics very heavily in his texts. He'll often use snippets or quotes from song lyrics at the beginning of different sections or chapters of his books to delineate what's going on in the story, and it provides not only an overarching theme, a kind of extended thread that ties everything together, but it also harkens back to his musical interest, which I think is just a fun fact about the author and something that directly translates into the book. I have yet to read this one, but my friend Alex Nishida was telling me back in middle school he was reading The Stand, which is insane because it's giant. Anyway, Alex was reading The Stand and he was telling me about how the song lyrics were definitely incorporated into that book in particular. So that's on my list. So far, I think I've only read On Writing and Pet Sematary, so. Then less directly, of course, there's the idea of music being incorporated as a motif or a symbol in books, whether that be an individual song or just the concept of music. I think actually of the To All the Boys I've Loved Before series by Jenny Han, at least in the film, I believe also in the book though, the dad takes our main character Lara Jean to a cafe to talk about her mom who passed away, because they don't really talk about her very much, and that's a big hole in their relationship. And while they're there, they play the song on the jukebox that her mom always used to play. So not only is music a great way to tie in personal aspects of the author's life and interests, it's also a way to weave through time, whether that be quite literally, for example, eras, decades, or between relationships that characters have.
You know, your mother and I used to come here all the time when we were dating.
Really? I didn't know that.
She'd play this song, then as soon as it was over, she'd play it again.
As I mentioned, that scene is from the movie, so let's talk about movies. Something I've always been very fascinated by are soundtracks. I actually just finished all of my applications to film school. It was incredibly intense because for the majority of the schools, you apply to the school, you apply to the program, and you apply to the specific major. For example, you apply to USC, you apply to their specific film school, SCA, and then you apply to film production or post-production or cinematic studies, things like that. It was really intense, and I'm really happy that I will never ever have to do that again. But at USC, and I'd imagine other film schools, there are options to take classes or even major in soundtracking, musical scores for film. If I've learned anything about filmmaking in the last 2 to 3 years that I've become really invested in it and interested in it and plan on pursuing it, it's that at the end of the day, audio matters significantly more so than visuals. Visuals are beautiful, they keep our attention, but if you are watching a gorgeously shot film and you cannot understand a single word of the dialogue, Christopher Nolan, then the story falls apart, it crumbles a bit. Whether that be the dialogue or the emotional intensity that music and sound effects can build, the Foley effects that are created to immerse you in this world. Without those, film isn't complete. And I think that's really heavily evidenced by how much we associate soundtracks with their corresponding films, stories in general, and then the books that those stories were drawn out from. For example, Lord of the Rings, like, you hear that soundtrack and you're there. You know, the suspense is there, the whimsy, the fantasy, the adventure, the sense of friendship. You can feel it all in every note of that soundtrack. The same goes for me, at least, for Jurassic Park. I love that soundtrack. Whenever I'm sad, I'll turn on the soundtrack for Jurassic Park, I will turn on the soundtrack for Pride and Prejudice 2005, or I will turn on Novo Amor, who is like not making movie soundtracks, but whose music I think is quite cinematic in its lyricism and ambient nature. Music then is able to enhance stories. It's able to draw us into a world further, leave us with a memory of that world in a different way than just imagination or mental thought, as opposed to non-mental thought. But you know what I mean. Through a different sense, it engages us and it keeps us enraptured with the world and with its characters and with its story. And I think that is a special type of magic. So that about wraps it up. Thank you all so much for being here. I just thought this was a really interesting concept, one I definitely love to delve into more and have conversations with people about. In the meantime, I'm gonna go to choir class. We're learning Titanium by Sia, but a 8-part, 9-part jazz choir arrangement. So pretty snazzy. And I will see you in about a quarter of a year. Have a wonderful time. Until then, bye.
But when somebody takes that vagueness and all that big collection of images and possible interpretations and takes it in such a diametrically opposed way to anything I'd ever even thought of, let alone intended, it's a little scary, but you have to say, well, that's good. You know, they were able to take what they wanted out of it. That's what they'll find. The same as a person that's sensitized to literary references. If they're looking for them, yes, they will find them, but if they're not, they won't.